The click of the combination lock was the loudest sound Delia Redmond had ever heard in her life. Louder than the gunshot that had taken her father 2 years ago. Louder than the thunder that rolled across the Kansas plains every spring. Louder even than the voice of Isaiah Hunter pressed against her back, his arm around her shoulders, his breath hot and ragged against her hair as he whispered, "It cannot be done. Nobody has cracked that safe in 11 years. Not the man who built it. Not the men who stole it. Nobody." And yet her fingers were already moving. The safe was a Diebold double-door iron chest, painted black, bolted to the floor of the First Territorial Bank of Cimarron, Kansas, in the year 1882. It was the kind of safe that made grown men weep and sheriffs lose sleep. It had survived a fire, a flood, and 3 documented robbery attempts, including one by the notorious Harlan Briggs gang, who had tried to blast it open with mining dynamite and had succeeded only in removing the back wall of the building and leaving the safe standing in the open air, completely untouched, mocking them under the stars. And Delia's fingers were already moving. Isaiah could not breathe. He was a man who had spent 7 years riding on the wrong side of the law, a man who had broken out of 2 jails, outrun 4 posses, and stared down a Comanche war party without flinching. He was 31 years old, 6'2", with hands like iron and a jaw that had taken more punches than he could count. He had seen things that haunted him. He had done things that shamed him. He was not easily rattled. But the woman crouched in front of that safe, her ear pressed close to the mechanism, her eyes closed, her fingers turning the dial with a precision that looked almost like prayer. That woman was rattling him straight down to his bones. Outside, 3 members of his former gang were circling the building. One of them had a rifle. One of them had a grudge. And all 3 of them wanted whatever was locked inside that safe, because inside that safe was the deed to every piece of land in a 50-mile radius, including the 160 acres that Delia Redmond had broken her back to claim under the Homestead Act, the land her father had died protecting, the land that Harlan Briggs had been trying to steal for 11 years. "Delia," Isaiah said, low and urgent, watching the door. "We have maybe 4 minutes." She did not answer. Her lips moved slightly, as though she were counting something, or praying something, or calculating something that required every fragment of her remarkable mind. He watched her, and despite everything, despite the danger pressing in from every side, despite the darkness, despite the blood drying on his knuckle from where one of Briggs's men had caught him in the alley, despite all of it, something cracked open in Isaiah Hunter's chest, something he had kept sealed tighter than any Diebold safe, and he thought, with a kind of terrified wonder, that he had never in his life seen anything more extraordinary than Delia Redmond in this moment. Then the safe opened. Not with a bang. Not with a blast. With a soft, clean, almost elegant click and the groan of well-oiled hinges as the iron door swung wide, and a small mountain of paperwork spilled forward into the dim lantern light, and Delia Redmond turned to look at Isaiah Hunter with those dark, steady eyes of hers and said, perfectly calmly, "I told you I could do it." He stared at her. She stared back. And that was the moment everything changed. But to understand how 2 people as different as Delia Redmond and Isaiah Hunter ended up crouched together in the dark of the First Territorial Bank of Cimarron, Kansas, with 3 armed outlaws circling outside, and the entire future of a community, locked inside a safe that only one of them could open, you had to go back 8 weeks, to the morning of a late September day in 1882, when a stranger rode onto the Redmond homestead with a bullet in his shoulder and very few good options left. The Redmond homestead sat on the eastern edge of the Cimarron River Valley, 160 acres of hard-won land that Delia had claimed herself under the Homestead Act of 1862, following the death of her father, James Redmond, who had started the claim and never lived to see it fulfilled. The law required 5 years of continuous improvement and residence before the land was officially yours. Delia was in year 3 when her father was shot, and she had not walked away. She had stayed. She had built a second room onto the soddy. She had planted wheat and kept it alive through 2 droughts. She had raised chickens and a small herd of cattle, repaired fences, negotiated with the feed merchant in town, and she had done all of it alone because there was no one else. She was 26 years old in the fall of 1882, brown-haired and sharp-eyed, with calloused hands and a mind that had been trained from childhood on one unusual skill. Her father had been a clockmaker before he came west, and he had taught Delia everything he knew about mechanical locks and precision mechanisms, because he believed, as he often said, that understanding how things opened and closed was a way of understanding the world. She could take apart a pocket watch and reassemble it blindfolded. She could diagnose the fault in a mechanical lock from the sound it made when the tumbler turned. She had a memory for numbers that was almost frightening, and a sensitivity in her fingertips that a surgeon might have envied. None of these skills were considered remarkable for a woman in 1882. Most people who knew about them thought they were a curiosity, something between a parlor trick and an eccentricity. Delia had long since stopped caring what other people thought about her skills or about her. She had more important things to do with her time. On the morning Isaiah Hunter rode onto her land, she was repairing the mechanism of the well pump, which had seized up overnight and which she had diagnosed, correctly, as having a worn leather valve. She was lying on her back in the dirt with her arm down inside the pump housing, working by feel, when she heard the sound of hooves slowing and a horse blowing hard, the way horses blow when they have been ridden too fast for too long. She did not panic. She withdrew her arm, stood up, and reached for the rifle that she kept leaning against the pump housing whenever she was working outdoors. She leveled it at the figure on horseback and said, "That is close enough." The man pulled up his horse, which was a big black gelding with a white blaze, and he was swaying in the saddle in a way that told her immediately that he was injured. His left arm was pressed against his side. His shirt was dark with blood. He had a face that would have been handsome under better circumstances, strong-jawed, dark-browed, with deep-set gray eyes that were watching her with an expression that was equal parts pain and wariness. "I am not here to cause trouble," he said. His voice was rough and low like gravel at the bottom of a creek. "You already look like trouble," she said. "Who are you?" "My name is Hunter, Isaiah Hunter." He paused, and she could see the effort it was taking him to stay upright. "I need water and a place to rest. I will pay." "What happened to your shoulder?" There was a brief hesitation, not the hesitation of a man deciding whether to lie exactly, but the hesitation of a man deciding how much of the truth to offer. "I rode into something I should have ridden around," he said. Delia kept the rifle leveled at him for a long moment. She was not afraid. She had been living alone on this claim for 2 years, and in that time she had turned away 3 unwanted visitors with nothing but her steadiness and the accuracy of her aim. But something about this man was different from the others. He was not trying to charm her or intimidate her. He was just sitting there bleeding, watching her with those gray eyes and waiting. "Get down," she said, slowly. "Keep your right hand where I can see it." He dismounted with a stiffness that told her the wound was worse than he was letting on, and when he stood beside the horse she could see that he was big, much bigger than the saddle had made him appear, broad across the shoulders, long in the leg, with the kind of physical presence that changed the atmosphere of a space just by entering it. She kept the rifle on him while she looked at the wound. It was a through and through in the meat of his left shoulder, not the kind that killed a man quickly, but the kind that went bad fast if it was not cleaned and dressed properly. "Inside," she said. She had him sit at the kitchen table while she heated water and gathered her supply of carbolic acid, clean cloth, and needle and thread. He sat very still while she cleaned and dressed the wound, which she did with an efficiency that made him watch her with a particular kind of attention, the kind that was trying to figure out who she was and what kind of place she occupied in the world. "You have done this before," he said. "Doctored a wound?" "Yes." "Where did you learn?" "My father taught me many things," she said, without elaborating, and tied off the bandage with a firmness that made him exhale sharply. He slept in the barn that night, on a clean pile of straw, and she locked the house and slept lightly with the rifle across her knees, which was how she always slept when she was not certain about something. By morning he was feverish, and she made the decision that she was not going to let him die on her property, not because she owed him anything, but because letting a man die of infection when she had the means to prevent it was not something she was capable of doing. She brought him inside and put him in the spare room, which she rarely used, and she nursed the fever for 3 days with cold cloths and willow bark tea and small, careful meals of broth and bread. On the 4th day the fever broke, and he lay in the spare bed looking at the ceiling with his gray eyes, and she sat in the doorway with her arms crossed and said, "You are going to tell me who you are now." It came out of him slowly, like water through a reluctant seam in the earth. Isaiah Hunter had grown up in Missouri, the son of a farmer who drank away everything they had. At 17 he had left and gone west, and at 19 he had fallen in with Harlan Briggs, which was the kind of mistake that a young man made when he was hungry and cold, and the man offering food and shelter and belonging asked only one thing in return. He had ridden with the Briggs gang for 4 years, doing things he was not proud of, before a botched robbery in Dodge City left 2 men dead, neither of them by his hand, but close enough to his hand that the distinction felt hollow, and he had ridden out of the gang in the night and spent the last 4 years trying to live differently. He was not wanted by the law, technically. There were no outstanding warrants with his name on them. But Harlan Briggs was a man who considered departure from his gang a personal betrayal, and he had sent men after Isaiah twice in 4 years, which was why Isaiah had been riding hard and why he had been in the wrong place when the bullet found him. Delia listened to all of this without changing her expression. When he was finished, she said, "And where do you plan to go from here?" "I am not sure," he said honestly. "There is work on this claim if you want it," she said. "I will pay fair wages, and I will not ask about your past again. If Briggs's men come here, you deal with them off my land. If they follow you here with violence in mind, you ride out before they arrive. Those are my terms." He looked at her for a long moment. "Why would you offer that?" "Because I need the help," she said without any false modesty. "The claim requires more maintenance than one person can handle going into winter, and I cannot afford to hire anyone permanent. You are here, you are able-bodied, and you appear to be trying to live honestly. Those are sufficient qualifications." Isaiah Hunter had met many women in his 31 years, but none quite like this one, who looked at him with those clear, direct eyes and offered employment on the same terms she might have offered it to anyone, not because she was naive about who he was, but because she had weighed what he was against what she needed and arrived at a practical conclusion. "All right," he said. "Yes." He started working the claim the following week, once he was well enough to swing a hammer and carry fence posts. He was a good worker, which did not surprise her, because he was the kind of man who went at everything with a complete and focused physical commitment. He repaired the barn roof, replaced 3 sections of fence along the western boundary, helped her dig and shore up a root cellar that she had been planning for months, and got the pump mechanism reassembled and working correctly, which she could have done herself but which went faster with 2 sets of hands. They worked alongside each other with a wordless efficiency that was comfortable in the way that unusual things sometimes become comfortable very quickly, when the fit is right. She noticed things about him. He was not a man who talked much, but when he did talk, he said what he meant. He was careful with her animals and her tools. He had a habit of sitting on the top fence rail at sunset and looking west at the sky, and she would sometimes watch him from the window, not because she was foolish enough to romanticize it, but because there was something in the shape of him against that enormous Kansas sky that was interesting to her, the way an interesting mechanical problem was interesting, something she wanted to understand. He noticed things about her too, though he was more careful about it. She was smarter than anyone he had met in years, maybe ever, and she made no effort to hide it or soften it for his benefit, which he found he preferred to the alternative. She fixed things by understanding them from the inside out. She made decisions quickly and stuck to them. She had a laugh that was rare but genuine, and when it happened, it changed her whole face. The trouble started in the third week of October, when the county land agent, a soft-handed man named Fletcher, rode out to the claim and told Delia that there was a challenge filed against her land title. Someone had submitted documentation to the Territorial Land Office, claiming prior right to a section of her claim along the northern boundary, and until the matter was resolved, her title was in dispute. Delia's expression did not change, but Isaiah, who had learned to read her better than he would have predicted, saw her hands go very still in her lap, and he understood that this was not a surprise to her. After Fletcher left, she told him about Harlan Briggs. Briggs was not primarily a bank robber. He was primarily a land thief. He had been operating in southwest Kansas for over a decade, using a combination of forged documents, corrupt officials, bought judges, and targeted violence to acquire land that was not his and sell it to the railroad, which was pushing its network west and which asked few questions about the provenance of land it purchased. At least 8 homestead families in the Cimarron Valley had been driven off their claims in the last 5 years. 2 of them had simply vanished. Several others had taken money to leave that they later described as having felt less like a purchase and more like a threat they could not afford to refuse. James Redmond, Delia's father, had been one of the people who refused. He had gathered documentation of what Briggs was doing, affidavits from displaced families, a paper trail that connected the forged land filings to Briggs and to his corrupt intermediaries, including a county official and at least one territorial judge. He had been planning to take this documentation to the federal land office in Wichita. He had been killed before he could do it. The documentation still existed. Delia had hidden it. And the original land deeds for all 8 of the claims that Briggs had stolen, along with a master deed that Delia's father had somehow obtained through channels she did not fully understand, were locked in the Diebold safe at the First Territorial Bank of Cimarron, which her father had put them in because the safe was the most secure location in the county, and because the bank manager, a man named Aldous Webb, had been one of his trusted friends. Aldous Webb had died the previous winter. His replacement was a man whose name was Crane, and Crane worked for Briggs. So the documentation is locked in a safe controlled by the man who wants to destroy it, Isaiah said, when she had laid all of this out for him with the methodical precision she brought to everything. Yes, Delia said, and the challenge to your land title is Briggs's opening move. Yes, once my title is in dispute, the land is vulnerable. He will file more challenges on more properties. He has already done it twice before with other claimants. It takes months to resolve, and in the meantime the families cannot get credit, cannot sell, cannot easily transfer. Some of them give up. He then swoops in with a very low offer and the suggestion that refusing would be unwise, and the documentation in the safe would expose all of it, every forged filing, every bribed official, every piece of land he has stolen. My father gathered 11 years of evidence. It is all there. Isaiah sat with this for a moment. How do you get into the safe if Crane controls the bank? Delia looked at him steadily. That is a question I have been working on for some time. You know how to crack a safe? I know a great deal about mechanical lock systems, she said carefully. Specifically, I believe I can open a Diebold 3-tumbler combination lock if I can get close enough to listen to the mechanism. My father taught me to read locks the way a musician reads sound. The tolerances in the mechanism produce different resistances at different points on the dial, and if you listen carefully enough, you can identify the contact points for each tumbler. He stared at her. That is the most extraordinary thing I have ever heard. It is applied mechanical theory, she said, without any particular vanity. The question is access. Crane will not let me anywhere near that safe. What if Crane were not available? She looked at him carefully. What are you thinking? I am thinking, he said slowly, that I spent 4 years doing things I am ashamed of. For a man, I have very good reason to want to see brought down, and I have certain skills in the area of acquiring access to places that do not want to be accessed. You mean breaking and entering? I mean, he said, that I know how to get into a locked building at night without making noise, yes. Delia looked at him for a long time. She was thinking, he could see it, turning the problem over and examining it from every angle the way she examined everything. He waited. We would need to know when the bank would be unoccupied, she said finally, not just after hours. Crane has a guard sleeping in the back most nights. We would need a reason for the guard to be elsewhere. I can create a distraction, and we would need the combination for the outer door lock, which is a standard sergeant key lock and which I cannot pick without tools I do not currently have. I can get the tools, and we would need a plan for Briggs's men, who will likely be watching the area if they know the documentation is in that safe. I know how Harlan Briggs thinks, Isaiah said. And I know his men. I rode with some of them. The plan they built over the next 10 days was careful and multi-layered, the kind of plan that only worked if every piece moved correctly, which meant it was the kind of plan that almost certainly would not work exactly as designed, which Delia acknowledged freely and which was why she built in 3 separate contingencies. The plan required an ally in town. They found one in the form of Margaret Solis, who ran the dry goods store in Cimarron and who had been displaced from her own homestead claim 3 years earlier by exactly the kind of forged documentation campaign that Delia was describing. Margaret was a compact, direct woman in her mid-40s who listened to everything Delia told her with increasing fury and increasing steadiness, and at the end said, "What do you need me to do?" She was the one who provided the information about the guard schedule. She had a son who worked at the livery stable next to the bank, and her son, a boy of 19 named Thomas, had been watching the bank's patterns for them since he started work there. The guard, a man named Pete Drover, spent every Tuesday evening at the saloon, because the saloon had a card game that started at 7, and Drover had a gambling problem that reliably kept him occupied until at least midnight. This gave them a window on Tuesday evenings when the bank was locked but not guarded, between the time Crane left at 5 and the time Drover returned from the saloon. The question was Crane's key. Crane locked the front door with a sergeant-keyed lock when he left each evening, and without the physical key, which was on Crane's person, there was no straightforward way through the front door. Delia had initially proposed a secondary entry through the rear window, which Thomas had confirmed was a standard double-hung sash window with a simple interior latch. But accessing the rear window required crossing an open alley that was, inconveniently, visible from the saloon's back porch, where Briggs's men had taken to spending their evenings. Isaiah had solved this problem in a way that Delia had not expected. He had ridden into Cimarron alone one morning, bold as daylight, and spent 2 hours in the saloon making himself known as a drifter looking for work. He had, in the process, gotten into a conversation with a man named Cole Reardon, who was one of Briggs's regulars and one of the men who had been circling Delia's claim since the land challenge was filed. He had not revealed himself as Isaiah Hunter. He had given a different name, and he had been very careful, because there were men in Briggs's employ who had known him by sight during his years with the gang. But Reardon did not know him, and over the course of 2 hours and several drinks, Isaiah had learned that Briggs was planning to move on the documentation within the week. Crane had received orders to remove everything from the safe, destroy what was destructive, and transfer the remaining deeds to a lawyer in Dodge City who was on Briggs's payroll. This was the information that changed their timeline from careful and measured to immediate and urgent. "We cannot wait for Tuesday," Isaiah told Delia when he returned. She was at the table with a hand-drawn diagram of the bank interior that Thomas had provided, and she looked up from it with those dark eyes and said simply, "When?" "Tonight." They were quiet for a moment while the weight of that settled. "What about the rear alley?" "I will clear it," he said. Reardon and the other man who takes the back porch in the evenings, their names are Webb and Collies. I know their habits from what Reardon told me today. At 8 o'clock they change their position to the front of the saloon for a pipe. There is a 15-minute window. 15 minutes to cross the alley, access the window, locate and open the safe, retrieve the documentation and exit. Yes. Delia looked at her diagram. I need longer than 15 minutes once I am in front of the safe. Listening to a Diebold 3-tumbler takes time. I cannot rush the mechanism. Then I create a longer window, he said. I distract Reardon and Collies directly, keep them occupied while you work. That is significantly more dangerous. Yes. She looked at him steadily, and something passed between them in that moment. Something that was not quite named but that both of them felt. A current of trust that had been building for weeks without either of them fully acknowledging it. He was offering to put himself in front of Briggs's men who had been hunting him to give her the time she needed, and she understood exactly what that cost. All right, she said. Then here is how we do it precisely. They went over the plan 3 more times before dark. She ate a small dinner and he ate the same, and they did not talk much while they ate, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people who were thinking about the same serious thing. At dusk he saddled the horses and she dressed in dark clothing, a dark wool dress and a dark jacket, with her hair pinned under a dark hat. She carried her rifle, which she could shoot with a precision that had surprised him the first time he saw her fire it, and she carried the small leather roll of tools that included 2 wire picks she had fashioned herself for the outer lock and a stethoscope, which had been her father's, that she would use to amplify the sounds of the combination mechanism. He wore his own dark clothing and his revolver, a Colt single-action army that was old but reliable. He had cleaned and oiled it the previous afternoon, with a care that she had noticed and filed away. They rode into Cimarron separately, arriving by different roads, and met in the shadow of the feed mill 2 blocks north of the bank at 7:15. The town was not asleep, but it was quiet, the way small frontier towns were quiet on weeknights in October, when the farmers and homesteaders had retreated to their houses, and the remaining activity was concentrated in the saloon and a handful of lit windows. The air was cold and smelled of wood smoke and horse, and the particular dusty sharpness of the Kansas plains. Thomas Solis was waiting for them at the feed mill. He was a lanky young man with his mother's directness and his own private terror that he was managing with considerable bravery. He confirmed that Drover had gone into the saloon as expected and that Crane had left the bank at 5:30. He had not seen anything unusual from Briggs's men. "You will wait here," Isaiah told him. "If anything goes wrong, you ride to your mother's and you stay there." Thomas nodded. Isaiah and Delia moved through the back alleys toward the bank, staying in the shadows with the ease of 2 people who had spent time being quiet outdoors. He watched her move ahead of him and thought, not for the first time, that she was the least helpless person he had ever been responsible for protecting, and then corrected himself, because she was not someone he was responsible for protecting. She was someone he was working alongside, and the distinction mattered. Reardon and Collies were on the saloon's back porch as expected, smoking and talking in low voices. Isaiah held Delia back in the shadow of a doorway with a light touch on her arm, and for a moment they stood very close in the dark, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her and smell the faint cedar and soap scent of her, and she turned her face slightly toward him and he saw her eyes in the dim light from a distant window, alert and calm and ready. "Give me 2 minutes, he said very quietly. She nodded. He moved around the long way, through a different alley, and came up behind the saloon from the north side. He made a specific sound, the sound of a man stumbling over a crate in the dark, which was not an unusual sound in a town with a saloon, and Reardon called out, "Who's there?" And Isaiah moved away from the sound, drawing them toward the far end of the back alley, away from the window, and while Reardon and Collies moved toward the noise, Delia crossed the open stretch of alley behind the bank in a quick, silent run and reached the rear window. He heard the faint sound of the window going up, and then silence. He kept Reardon and collies occupied with a variety of manufactured sounds, and one brief misdirecting conversation from a shadow, claiming to be a drunk looking for the outhouse, which produced laughter from Reardon and a redirect toward the actual outhouse, and 2 or 3 minutes of relaxed inattention that he used to cross the alley himself and duck through the rear window. Inside the bank it was dark, except for the faint line of light under the front door from the street lamp outside. He found Delia by the safe and crouched beside her and said, against her ear, "Are we clear?" "I am just starting," she said softly. He watched the front window and listened to the town outside while she worked. He had known, in theory, what she was going to do. She had explained it to him in considerable detail, the method by which she could read the resistances in a combination locks tumbler system by feel and sound, using the stethoscope to amplify the tiny sounds made by the internal mechanism, building a map of the combination point by point over a sustained period of careful listening. He had understood it intellectually, and he had believed her when she said she could do it, because, in his experience, Delia, Redmond did not claim capabilities she did not possess. But watching her do it was different from understanding it. She was completely still in the way that required more physical control than motion did, her ear against the scope, her fingers on the dial, her whole attention narrowed to a point somewhere inside the mechanism. The room was very quiet. He could hear the distant sounds of the saloon and the wind off the planes against the front windows, and very faintly, the sound of his own breathing, which he tried to slow. 3 minutes passed. 5. He watched the window. Reardon and collies came back to the porch. He heard their voices, too distant to make out the words but not alarmed. They had not heard anything to alarm them. He exhaled slowly. 8 minutes. He heard Delia make a very small sound, not quite a sound, more like the slight release of tension in someone who has just confirmed a belief. Her fingers moved the dial in a small, precise arc. Stopped. Moved again. 10 minutes. He was aware, the way you were aware of an open flame near dry wood, that every minute they were in this bank was a minute closer to discovery. Crane might have reason to return. Drover's card game might break up early. Briggs's men might decide to look closer. Any number of things could go wrong, and he was the only thing standing between all of those possibilities and Delia and the documentation that she needed. He was also aware, underneath that awareness and deeper than it and less comfortable because of that depth, that he did not want anything to happen to Delia Redmond. Not because of the plan, not because she was necessary to the plan's success, but because the idea of something happening to her had a specific weight that plans and success did not have. He had met her 38 days ago and she was a near stranger, and the idea of something happening to her had that specific personal weight, and he was honest enough with himself, alone in the dark of the bank while she worked, to acknowledge what that probably meant. 11 minutes. Click. He spun around. The safe door swung open and the papers spilled forward, and Delia turned to look at him, perfectly calm, perfectly composed, those dark, steady eyes finding his in the dim light. "I told you I could do it," she said. He stared at her. He had no words. The thing cracking open in his chest was doing so at a pace that was not compatible with maintaining composure, and he stood there in the dark of that bank, with outlaws outside and the clock running, and he felt something close in on him that was not any kind of danger he had ever learned to defend against. "Isaiah," she said, with a slight edge of urgency that he recognized as the practical part of her reasserting itself. "We need to move." He crossed the room in 3 strides and knelt beside the safe, and they went through the documents together, quickly but carefully, Delia identifying each item with a sureness that told him she had an intimate knowledge of what her father had assembled. The original deed filings for 8 homestead claims, a set of sworn affidavits from 7 displaced families, a ledger with records of payments made to county and territorial officials, a letter, in Briggs's own handwriting, directing Crane's predecessor to alter filed land records, and a master deed document that her father had obtained from the original territorial land survey records, predating all of Briggs's forgeries. She bundled these into the oilskin satchel she had brought, secured it across her body, and closed the safe door. She then spent 45 seconds manipulating the combination back to a neutral setting that would not immediately reveal it had been opened, which was the kind of detail Isaiah would not have thought of and which he noted, not for the last time, as evidence of a mind that was always 2 steps further ahead than most. They went out the way they had come in. In the alley he felt it before he saw it, the particular tension of a space that was occupied by someone who did not want to be heard. He caught Delia's arm and pulled her back against the building wall a half-second before Cole, Reardon stepped out of the shadow at the end of the alley with a shotgun. "Hunter," Reardon said, with a satisfaction that meant he had known who Isaiah was all along and had been waiting. Isaiah had wondered about that. He had been careful in the saloon, but Reardon had friends and those friends had descriptions. The 2 hours of conversation had probably been Reardon's own intelligence gathering, a mirror operation, both of them taking what they needed. "Cole," Isaiah said, "Harlan wants to know what you took out of that safe. Tell Harlan he can ask me himself." Reardon raised the shotgun slightly. He did not look at Delia, which was a mistake. Isaiah knew it was a mistake the moment it happened, and he saw from the slight shift of Delia's weight that she was about to do something. What she did was take 2 fast sidesteps to her right, into the shadow on the opposite side of the alley from where Isaiah was standing, which split Reardon's attention by forcing him to choose between them. In the fraction of a second that Reardon's eyes moved from Isaiah to locate her, Isaiah closed the distance between himself and Reardon with a speed that his size did not seem to permit, got one hand on the barrel of the shotgun, drove it upward, and put Reardon on the ground with his other hand before the man could recover. It was over in perhaps 3 seconds. Delia was already moving toward the far end of the alley. Isaiah checked Reardon, who was stunned but not seriously hurt, secured his hands with a length of rope from his own pocket, and followed her. They reached the horses without encountering collies, who had apparently gone inside the saloon, and rode out of Cimarron at a steady pace that did not attract attention, not the panicked gallop of people fleeing but the measured trot of people going home, which was what they were doing. It was only when they were clear of town and onto the open road with the black sky full of stars above them that Isaiah let himself take a full breath. Beside him, Delia was riding straight-backed, one hand on the reins, the other resting on the satchel against her side, and her face, when he looked at it in the starlight, was not the face of someone in triumph or in relief. It was calm, steady. The same face she had turned on him the morning he rode onto her claim with a bullet in his shoulder and very few options. The same face she brought to every problem she encountered. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. And then, after a moment, "Are you?" "Yes," he said. They rode in silence for a while, and the silence was different from their earlier silences, heavier and sweeter, and full of all the things that had not been said in 6 weeks of working alongside each other, and now had a little more room to move. "I was right about the safe," she said, not quite to him, almost to herself, with a quiet satisfaction that was the closest thing to pride he had heard in her voice. "You were right about everything," he said, and there was something in his voice that was more than the simple agreement of one practical person to another, and she heard it and looked at him, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. They got back to the homestead at 10:30 and saw to the horses before they did anything else, because that was how both of them were, the animals first, always. In the barn by lantern light, he unbridled the black gelding and she unbridled her gray mare, and their hands sometimes crossed in the narrow space between the horses, and neither of them moved away when it happened. Inside the house she laid the documents on the table and they went through them again more carefully in the full light of the lamp. He watched her face as she read her father's handwriting in the affidavits, and he saw the grief in it, not dramatic grief, not the kind that came with tears or display, but the quiet, weight-bearing grief of someone who had been carrying a loss for 2 years and had learned to carry it efficiently. "He was a thorough man," Isaiah said, meaning it as the compliment it was. "He was," she said. "He believed that evidence was the only honest argument. He was right." She looked up from the papers and looked at him across the table, and this time neither of them looked away, and the thing that had been building for 6 weeks between them arrived at a point where it could no longer be usefully ignored. "Isaiah," she said. "Delia," he said. And then they were both quiet because the thing was said in the names, in the way they said them, and they both knew it. He stood up from the table and came around to her side slowly, giving her every opportunity to redirect or stop him, because that was the kind of man he was trying to be, the kind who gave time and choice rather than taking them. She watched him come and did not redirect him and did not stop him, and when he was standing beside her she stood up too, and they were very close, and he raised one hand and touched her face, just the lightest possible touch along her cheekbone, and she turned into it slightly, and he thought the world might simply stop turning and it would be fine. "I do not have a great deal to offer," he said, low and serious. "My past is what it is. I have land somewhere in Missouri I have not seen in years. I have a horse and a rifle and the wages I have earned here. I am trying to be a better man than I was, and I cannot promise I will always succeed." "I did not ask for promises," she said. "I asked for honesty." "Then honestly," he said, "I have not looked at anything the way I look at you in a very long time, maybe ever." She was quiet for a moment, studying him with those direct eyes that saw through things rather than at them. "I am not a woman who needs someone," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I have managed this claim alone and I could continue to do so." "I know," he said. "But I have also noticed," she said, "that wanting someone and needing them are different things, and the wanting is not nothing." "No," he said, "it is not nothing." She put her hand over his, the one still resting against her face, and held it there, and that was enough for that night, which was not a night for more than that, because there was still too much that needed to be resolved in the world outside this house before they could afford the luxury of the world inside it. The next morning Delia rode to the county seat at Ulysses with the documentation secured in the oilskin satchel, and Isaiah rode with her, because the road between Cimarron and Ulysses was 50 miles of open country, and she was carrying material that Harlan Briggs would kill to prevent from reaching the county clerk's office, and they both knew it. They took the eastern road rather than the direct route, adding 12 miles to the journey but reducing the likelihood of being intercepted on a road that Briggs's men knew. They rode at a pace that covered ground efficiently without burning out the horses. He watched the horizon and the draws and the creek crossings that could hide a man on horseback, and she rode beside him with the satchel close and her rifle across her saddlebag and her eyes clear and forward-looking. They were 2 hours out of Cimarron when they saw the dust. It was behind them and to the north, 2 riders moving at a pace that was faster than casual travel. Isaiah watched it for several minutes before he spoke. "We have company," he said. She did not look back. "How many?" "2 that I can see, possibly a third further back. Collies and Reardon." She paused. "Reardon, you said you left him tied." "He has had 8 hours, she thought. "There is a homestead claim 2 miles east, the Garza family. Miguel Garza is one of the families my father documented. He has reason to help us. Can we make it ahead of the riders?" She looked at the dust, made a calculation that he could see her making, angles and distances and speeds, the same way she calculated everything. "Yes, if we move now." They moved. The Garza homestead was a tidy soddy on a gentle rise with a kitchen garden and a small corral, and a windmill turning in the October wind. Miguel Garza was a lean, dark-mustached man of about 50 who came to the door with a rifle before they had reached the yard and put it down when he saw Delia. "Miss Redmond," he said, and then looked at Isaiah with a measuring look that Isaiah understood and did not resent. "Mr. Garza," Delia said, "I have the documentation my father compiled. I am carrying it to the county clerk at Ulysses. There are two of Briggs's riders behind me." Garza's expression changed. It was a profound change, the change of a man who had been waiting years for a specific piece of news and had not quite believed it would ever come. "You found it," he said. "Your father's evidence." "All of it," she said, "and more." "Come in," he said, and to Isaiah, extending a hand, "I am Miguel Garza, Isaiah Hunter." "He is with me," Delia said, and the simplicity of that statement had more weight than she might have intended, and Garza heard it and looked between them with a brief, private expression before leading them inside. The Garza family, which included Miguel's wife, Rosa, and their two adult sons, provided them with food, fresh horses, and a decoy. One of the sons, Ernesto, rode out on Delia's gray mare heading south, drawing the two riders, while Isaiah and Delia remounted on the Garza horses and rode east for Ulysses on the back road that followed the creek. Rosa Garza pressed Delia's hands between her own before they left and said something in Spanish that Delia replied to in Spanish, which was another of the things about her that Isaiah filed away without commentary. A woman who had lived in southwest Kansas long enough to have learned the language of her neighbors because it was useful, and because they were her neighbors. They reached Ulysses in the late afternoon of the second day and went directly to the county clerk's office, which was in the courthouse on the main street, a two-story frame building that smelled of paper and coal, oil, and authority. The county clerk was a bespectacled man named Hartley who received the documentation with an increasing intensity of attention that was satisfying to watch. He read the affidavits. He examined the original deed filings. He read the ledger pages. He held Briggs's handwritten letter up to the light and looked at it for a long time. "This is extraordinary," he said finally. "My father thought so," Delia said. "Some of these land challenges that have been filed, including the one against your claim, Miss Redmond, are directly contradicted by the material here." "Yes. The challenge against your claim can be dismissed within the week once I file these with the Territorial Land Office. And the others," he looked at the documentation again. "This goes further than the county clerk's jurisdiction, Miss Redmond. This is a matter for the Federal Land Office and possibly the Federal Marshal." "Then I would suggest you contact them," she said. Hartley looked at her over his spectacles with the expression of a man reassessing what he was looking at. "I will," he said. "I will do so today." They stayed in Ulysses that night at the hotel, 2 separate rooms, which was proper, and Delia slept better than she had in months, maybe years, the sleep of someone who had been carrying a specific weight and set it down. When she came down to breakfast, she found Isaiah already at the table with coffee, looking out the window at the main street of Ulysses with that same expression he had when he sat on the fence at sunset, something behind it that he mostly kept private. "What are you thinking?" she asked, sitting down across from him. He looked at her. "I am thinking about Missouri," he said. "The land I told you about, my father's farm." She poured her coffee. "What about it?" "I have not been back in 12 years. I have been moving since I was 17, and it occurs to me that I have been moving partly because there was nowhere I wanted to stop." She looked at him across the table. The morning light came through the window and lay across his face and hands, and he was a man, she thought, who had been shaped by hard things in the way that hard things could shape you into something worth keeping if you let them work on the right parts of you. "And now," she said. "And now I am not sure moving is what I want," he said. "I am not sure it has been what I wanted for about 6 weeks." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the window a wagon went past and a dog barked, and the morning of the frontier town proceeded around them as mornings always did. "The claim requires 5 continuous years of improvement in residence," she said. "I am in year 3. I have 2 more years before the title is secure." He watched her. "2 more years of work," she said. "Hard work. A Kansas winter which is its own kind of battle. Another growing season, maybe 2, fences and wells and a proper barn." "I have built things before," he said. "I know you have. And I am good with a Kansas winter," he said. "I spent one in a jail in Dodge City, which is about as cold as it gets." She laughed. That rare, genuine laugh that changed her face, and he felt it in his chest the same way he had felt it the first time she had laughed, standing beside the well pump with grease on her hands, laughing at something he had said about the stubbornness of pump mechanisms, and he had thought that first time that he was in some trouble, and he had been right. "Isaiah," she said more seriously, "if you are proposing to stay, you should be clear about what you are proposing." He set down his coffee cup and looked at her with the directness that had become, he realized, the natural register of their communication, two people who had said enough indirect things to know that the direct ones were better. "I am proposing to stay," he said. "I am proposing to work your claim with you, for as long as that is what you want. And I am proposing that if it is something you are willing to consider, I would like to be more to you than a hired hand, Delia. I think you know that." She held his gaze for a long moment. The morning light was in her hair. She had her hands around her coffee cup, and she was still and composed in the way that was the deepest part of her nature, that deep stillness out of which all her remarkable capability came. "I am willing to consider it," she said. "That is the honest answer," he nodded. "That is enough for me." They rode back to the Cimarron Valley 2 days later, stopping again at the Garza homestead, where they learned that Ernesto had successfully drawn the two riders south and lost them in the breaks along the Cimarron River, and that Reardon had reportedly left town heading west, which suggested that Briggs had been informed of what had happened and had withdrawn his immediate operation. That did not mean Briggs was finished. A man like Harlan Briggs did not become what he was by giving up easily. But the documentation was now with the county clerk, copies had been sent to the federal land office, and Hartley had, as promised, contacted the federal marshal's office in Wichita. The machinery of legitimate authority was moving slowly, as it always moved, but moving. It was harder to stop than one bullet, or one threat, or one disappeared homesteader. Much harder to stop than all of those things together. They arrived back at Delia's homestead on a gray November afternoon, with a smell of coming snow in the air, and the light going amber and early over the flat land. She unsaddled the horses while he carried water from the well, and they moved around the yard and the barn with the ease of two people who had worked in close physical proximity long enough to know each other's rhythms. And when the animals were settled and the water was in, and the first snow was beginning to come down in small, thin flakes, they went inside and she built up the fire, and he set a pot of beans on the stove, and they did not talk much. But what was between them in the silence was warm. Over the weeks that followed, through the first hard push of winter, things shifted between them in the way that things shift when people live and work in close proximity and stop, pretending that what is there is not there. They were careful with each other, respectful of each other's independence and space in the way that two self-sufficient people naturally are. But there were also other things. The way he handed her a tool before she had finished asking for it. The way she noticed, without being asked, when he was favoring his shoulder in cold weather and left the willow bark tea on the table without comment. The way they sometimes sat by the fire in the evening and read, separately but in the same space, and the quality of that shared silence was something neither of them had experienced enough to have a name for, but that both of them guarded. He had moved from the barn to the small lean-to room he had built onto the side of the house in October, which was warmer, and which she had suggested with a practicality that covered several things at once. It was entirely proper, and they both behaved entirely properly. But the fact of him being on the other side of a thin plank wall rather than across the yard was a different kind of proximity, and she was aware of it in the evenings, and he was aware of it, and neither of them mentioned it, which was its own kind of communication. The news from the county seat and from Wichita came in pieces through the winter, carried by riders and mail coaches, and eventually by the telegraph office in Dodge City, which was 40 miles north but whose news filtered back through the valley within days of arriving. The federal marshal's office had opened an investigation into Harlan Briggs in December. 3 of the 8 displaced homestead families whose claims were documented in Delia's father's files had come forward with additional testimony. Two of the county officials implicated in the ledger had resigned their positions. The corrupt territorial judge, faced with the documentary evidence, had agreed to cooperate with the investigation in exchange for consideration. And in January, Harlan Briggs was arrested in Dodge City on charges of land fraud, filing false documents with a federal land office, conspiracy to commit fraud, and 3 counts of extortion. He was remanded to the federal jail in Wichita to await trial. Delia heard this news on a January morning from the mail coach driver who had it from the telegraph, and she stood in the yard in the cold with the paper in her hands and read it twice and then looked up at Isaiah, who had come out of the barn to see what the coach had brought, and she said quietly, "He is arrested." Isaiah was still for a moment. Then he crossed the yard to her and stood close, looking at the paper. "Tried, convicted, and the land restored," he said. "That will take longer," she said. "The trial will be spring at the earliest, but it has started." "Your father's work," Isaiah said. "Yes," she said. And her voice was steady, but he put his hand against her back, just there, just a steadying presence, and she leaned into it very slightly, just for a moment. And they stood there in the January cold with the paper between them and the news of a 11-year injustice beginning to be addressed. And there was grief and relief and satisfaction all wound together in the air between them, and he did not move his hand. She turned to look at him, and he was right there close, and she thought, with a clarity that was characteristic of her, that she had arrived at one of those points in life where the honest thing and the wanted thing were the same thing, and that she had spent enough years being practical to recognize when practicality and desire were pointing in the same direction. "Isaiah," she said. "Yes," he said, as though he already knew the question. "I have been considering what you said in Ulysses," she said. "For several months now. I noticed," he said, with a slight edge of warmth in his voice. "I have arrived at a conclusion," she said. He waited. "I would like you to stay," she said. "Not as a hired hand, as a partner in the claim, in the work." She paused, and this pause was the only pause that had cost her anything to make. "And in whatever comes after the claim is finalized, if that is what you mean." He looked at her, and the thing in his chest that had been cracking open since the night she opened the safe did something final and complete. "That is exactly what I mean," he said. He kissed her, standing in the January cold in the yard of her homestead, with the bare Kansas plains around them and the sky very wide and gray-blue above. And she kissed him back with the same focused, complete attention she brought to everything that mattered to her. And it was a considerable kiss, full of everything that 6 weeks of working silence and 3 months of careful honesty had been building toward. They were married in March in Cimarron at the small Methodist church on the east side of town, which was not the grandest church in Kansas, but which had the virtue of being the one they actually had. And Margaret Solis was there with Thomas, and Miguel and Rosa Garza were there with their sons, and the Reverend Davis performed the ceremony with a cheerful efficiency that matched the occasion. Delia wore a dress of deep blue wool that Rosa Garza had helped her alter from a bolt of cloth that Margaret had contributed, and she carried a small bunch of dried wildflowers that she had pressed the previous summer without knowing what she was saving them for. She looked, Isaiah thought, from the front of the church where he was standing, like herself, which was exactly what she looked like, and he had never in his life been so grateful for that specific fact. He wore a clean shirt and his good coat, and a new hat that Thomas Solis had talked him into buying from the dry goods store, and when she came down the aisle she looked at him with those direct, dark eyes and smiled, not the polite smile of formality but the real one, the rare one, and he felt it in his chest the way he always felt it. After the ceremony, Margaret Solis laid out a supper in the church hall, and Miguel Garza produced a guitar, and the evening was warm with food and music, and the particular celebration of people who had fought for something, and were now allowing themselves the luxury of enjoying what the fight had protected. They rode home in the dark of the March night, the two of them under a sky full of stars, and the plains were wide and cold and theirs, or very nearly theirs, with 2 more years of work before the title was fully secured, and that was fine. 2 years of work was what they had ahead of them, and they had everything they needed to do it. The trial of Harlan Briggs concluded in June 1883 in Wichita, and the verdict was guilty on all counts. He received 15 years in the federal penitentiary, which was less than the ruined lives he had left behind might have warranted, but was, as Isaiah said quietly to Delia when they heard the news, a verdict that would hold. Briggs's intermediaries, including Crane the banker and 2 county officials, received lesser sentences in exchange for their cooperation. The territorial judge who had cooperated with the investigation had his sentence suspended on condition of resignation and restitution. And the 8 Homestead families whose claims had been stolen, including the family of the woman whose claim had been the first one Briggs had taken, a widow named Abigail Foster, who had been living in Dodge City for 3 years working in a laundry, began the process of being restored to their land. That process took until the fall of 1883 to complete, and it was not completed cleanly or without difficulty, because the legal and administrative machinery of the frontier did not move quickly or smoothly, and some of the families chose not to return, because 3 or 4 years had passed and new lives had formed in new places, and the pull of the original land was not as strong as it had been. But some of them came back. The Garza family, who had never entirely left, had their title restored without complication. Abigail Foster came back in September, a gray-haired woman with quick eyes who shook Delia's hand and held it for a moment and said, "Your father was a good man, and you are his daughter entirely." "Thank you," Delia said, and this time there were tears briefly, which she did not try to suppress. Isaiah saw them and did not mention them and put his arm around her outside, in the yard of the old Foster homestead, which was looking neglected but repairable, the way most neglected things looked if you were the kind of person who saw possibility rather than damage. She leaned against him and he held her there in the September afternoon, and she let herself be held, which was something she had been learning slowly, was not a reduction of her capability but a different expression of it, the capacity to let someone else be the strength for a moment, which required its own kind of courage. Their son was born in April of 1884, 8 days before Delia's 28th birthday, and they named him James for her father. He was a solid, good-natured baby with Isaiah's gray eyes and Delia's particular habit of watching everything with an intense, focused attention that made visitors laugh and his parents secretly proud. He slept in a cradle that Isaiah had built from cottonwood lumber through the winter months, working on it in the evenings by lamplight with the same careful, focused hands he brought to every physical task, and Delia had watched him work on it from across the room with the particular quality of feeling that she had no better word for than gratitude, though it was larger than gratitude, something that included it and extended beyond it in every direction. The homestead title cleared in November of 1884, 5 years from the original filing, and the document that arrived from the county clerk's office was a plain piece of paper with printing and stamps and signatures, nothing dramatic in its appearance. But when Delia spread it on the table in the lamplight and read the description of the property and the name of the title holder, which was now Delia Hunter, formerly Redmond, she pressed her hand flat against the paper for a moment and closed her eyes, and Isaiah, who was across the room with young James on his knee, watched her and understood the weight of the moment and did not speak. She opened her eyes and looked at him and smiled, and he smiled back. "It is done," she said. "It is done," he agreed. James, who was 7 months old and had opinions about most things, made a sound of general commentary from his father's knee, and they both laughed. In the years that followed, the Redmond claim, which was by common usage still called the Redmond claim by the neighbors even after the name on the title changed, grew and changed and improved. Isaiah added a proper frame house alongside the soddy, not replacing it immediately but building alongside it so they could move in stages, which Delia approved of for the practical reason that the soddy was warmer in winter and would continue to be useful as a storage room. He expanded the barn. They acquired 4 additional cattle in 1885 and a proper team of draft horses for the plow in 1886. Delia continued to do the things she was good at, not only the mechanical and logical work, but also, increasingly, a kind of informal advisory role among the homesteaders of the valley. People came to her with mechanical problems and legal questions and disputes about property boundaries, and once, memorably, a family from 3 counties over who had heard that there was a woman near Cimarron who could read a locked mechanism, and who needed her help locating a document that a deceased relative had locked in a strongbox without leaving the combination. She opened that strongbox in 12 minutes flat. Isaiah watched her do it and felt exactly what he always felt when he watched her work, which was a particular combination of pride and wonder and love that was, he had come to understand, the thing that was going to sustain him for the rest of his life without any sign of diminishing. Their second child, a girl they named Clara Rose, arrived in the summer of 1886, when James was 2 years old and thoroughly opinionated about his position as the center of the household, which Clara's arrival adjusted in ways that he initially protested and eventually accepted with a grudging graciousness that made his parents laugh regularly. Clara had her mother's dark hair, and very early, her mother's particular quality of quiet, focused attention, and Delia watched her daughter with a feeling she could not entirely articulate, something about the seeing of yourself in another person, not as a mirror but as a possibility. In 1887, Margaret Solis' son Thomas married a young woman from Ulysses named Frances, and the wedding was a cause for considerable celebration among the families of the valley. And at the supper afterward, when the music was playing and the dancing was underway, Isaiah asked Delia to dance, which she accepted with the slight smile that meant she was pleased but was not going to say so directly, and they danced 3 times, and Margaret Solis watched them from the far side of the room and thought, privately, that they were one of the best arguments for the frontier that she had ever encountered, 2 people who had found each other in hard circumstances and made something extraordinary out of the combination. In the evenings after the children were in bed, Isaiah and Delia had developed a particular routine that had accrued around them over the years the way these things do, naturally and without announcement. She read, usually, or worked on something with her hands, a mechanism she was examining or a clock she was repairing, because the repair of clocks and watches had become a small secondary income that she pursued when the farm work allowed, her father's trade carrying forward into the next generation of their family in the most natural way. He sat across from her and sometimes read and sometimes simply sat, and they talked when there was something to say and were quiet when there was not, and the fire was warm and the plains wind was outside, and the children were sleeping and they were entirely themselves together, which was the best thing, the thing worth all the rest of it. He told her, one evening in the winter of 1887, what he had never quite said directly, because he was a man who communicated in other registers and had spent 5 years letting those other registers do the work, that he had made a great many mistakes in his life and had been a great many kinds of wrong, but that coming onto the Redmond homestead with a bullet in his shoulder and very few options had been the most fortunate thing that had ever happened to him, and that he thought about the shape of his life differently because of her, not only the current shape but the past shape, because even the mistakes seemed different from where he was now, like the ruts in a road that had led somewhere worth being. She set down the clock she was working on and looked at him across the table, and there was warmth in her eyes that was not often visible, not because she did not feel it but because she was not a person who wore her feeling on the outside, and she said, "You are not a man who needed saving, Isaiah. You were already doing the work of saving yourself when you rode in here. I may have just given you somewhere to stop." He held her gaze for a long time. "Is there a difference?" he said. "Probably not," she said, and picked up the clock again. And he smiled at her, and she saw it from behind the clock and smiled back. And that was how they were, even after years, even when the specific urgency of new love had deepened into the fuller, quieter thing that came after. The thing that was not less than the earlier intensity but was more reliable than it, more weatherproof, built from the same materials as the house he had built alongside her, soddy, frame by frame, meant to stand. The Harlan Briggs that Delia had spent years being afraid of, not of the man himself, but of the system he represented, the use of institutional power to dispossess ordinary people from the land they had worked and earned. That Harlan Briggs remained in the federal penitentiary through the rest of the decade, and the machinery her father had set in motion, the documentation, the evidence, the affidavits that forced legitimate institutions to function as they were supposed to. That machinery outlasted him and his network and the corrupt officials he had employed, because evidence properly preserved and properly placed is harder to destroy than any individual person or group of people, which was the thing James Redmond had believed and had been right about. The land her father had claimed, the land she had held against threat and loss and isolation and injustice, was hers, properly and legally and finally. And beside her in the life that had built itself around that land was a man who had arrived broken-shouldered and dark-pastured, and had stayed because staying was what he had finally found worth doing, and who looked at her still, after years, with that specific look that meant he had not yet stopped being surprised by her, which was the look she valued most in all the world. Their third child was a boy, born in 1889, and they named him Daniel. He had his father's height from very early and his mother's particular quality of focus, and he also, from the time he could reach the table, took apart every mechanical thing in the house that could be taken apart, which Delia observed with a deep private satisfaction, and Isaiah observed with a mixture of paternal pride and mild concern for the welfare of the household's operational equipment. The homestead in those years was full in the way that homes are full when they have been built by people who worked for them, full of the specific weight of things chosen and kept. The cradle Isaiah had made from cottonwood, the pocket watch and stethoscope that had been James Redmond's and were now Delia's, the land deed in its frame on the wall beside the window that looked west over the plains, the tools that bore the marks of use, the modest evidence of a life constructed carefully and with intention. In the evenings the children grew, and the fire was warm, and the conversation across the table was the conversation of two people who knew each other well and found in that knowledge, as the years extended it, and the shared history deepened it, not boredom but comfort, not limitation but a kind of freedom that only came from the specific trust of long familiarity, from knowing that the person across the table was exactly who they appeared to be, had been that person consistently for years, and would continue to be, and that this was enough, more than enough, that it was, in fact, the thing. Isaiah Hunter, who had spent 17 years in motion after the age of 17, and had believed, in his darker periods, that motion was what he was built for, had stopped moving. He had stopped because the land was worth working, and because the work was worth doing, and because the woman beside him made the staying better than any going had ever been. He had, at various points in his life, done things that he was ashamed of, and those things did not disappear, but they had a different context from where he stood now, a context that included the 5 years of homestead work, and the marriage and the children and the community of the Cimarron Valley, and the specific weight of a life that had consequence in the lives around it. He was a man who had thought himself a man of motion, an outlaw by nature if not entirely by choice, and he had discovered, in the most unexpected way and the most unlikely place, that he was something different from that. That the sealed thing in him had needed not a key or a blast, but a particular kind of careful, patient, knowing attention, the same attention that opened safes and fixed clocks and held broken things until they were ready to hold themselves. The woman who had provided that attention had done so without pity and without sentiment, and with the precise, focused capability that was the finest thing about her. And she had not done it because he needed saving and she was the one to save him, but because they were two practical people who recognized in each other something worth working alongside, and had let that recognition grow into something larger, season by season, the way all durable things grew on the Kansas plains. The plains were wide, and the sky above them was impossibly large, and the life that two people could build under that sky, if they were willing to work for it and honest about what they were building, was larger than either of them had known to expect when the story began, when the outlaw rode onto the homestead with a bullet in his shoulder and a pass behind him, and the homesteader stood up from the well pump with grease on her hands and a rifle leveled at his chest and said, with perfect steadiness, "That is close enough." It had not been close enough then. And in the years since, the distance between them had closed to nothing, or rather to the nothing that is not absence but presence, the nothing of the space between two people who have stopped needing space between them, who have learned to occupy the same ground so completely that the ground itself is changed by it, worked into something that neither of them could have made alone, which is the best thing that can be made on the frontier or anywhere else. The deed on the wall said the land was hers. The ring on her finger said the life beside her was chosen. The children in the next room said the future was made. And the man across the table, watching her work on the clock with those steady hands and that focused mind, was the man who had been completely, irreversibly stunned by her in the dark of a bank in 1882 and had never quite recovered from that stunnedness, which was not a weakness in him but the opposite, the best evidence of his quality, that he could recognize what was extraordinary and name it and stay beside it for the whole of a life. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.